What would you do if you saw something phenomenal in the sky? Something so incredible that you know you will never see anything else like that again. Take as an example the atomic bomb and its brilliant mushroom cloud. If you had no idea that it emitted radiation, would you not be tempted to take a closer look? There is a famous biblical story about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels come down to save Lot and his family from the disaster. They instruct him and his family to follow them out of the city, but not to look back under any circumstance. However, Lot's wife can't help herself. These cities are not just being destroyed by some human agency. God is casting divine judgment upon them. What does that look like? She looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt. On the evening of December 29, 1980, Betty Cash, a friend, Vickie Landrum, and her 7-year-old grandson, Colby, were placed in a similar scenario. Something phenomenal was happening in the sky near Houston International Airport. A huge, unknown craft shaped like a huge upright diamond with flames flaring downward to the ground, and they were driving dead into it. They gave various reasons for why they did not turn around, even when the heat emitted from the craft was so intense that they had to stop and get out of the car for fear of being burned alive. Despite the discomfort, Betty stood outside, mesmerized by the bizarre sight. Vickie was a born-again Christian, so for her this was not some extraterrestrial phenomena, but rather the second coming of Christ. Colby was probably the most logical of the trio at this moment, for he was adamantly crying out for them to get back in the car and leave. Vickie went back in the car and soothed Colby by telling him that Jesus would not hurt us. They were being hurt. At that moment, radiation was embedding itself into their car and bodies. Later medical reports would attest to mysterious injuries, even possibly cancer, linked to this event. Indeed, the radiation probably hurt more the brave men and women who piloted the military helicopters that started to fly over their heads directly towards the craft. My name is Eric, and you're watching The Paranormal Scholar. A little over 8 months after the UFO incident, Captain John Camp, Captain Terry Davis, and his assistant Miss Pat Wolf of the U.S. Air Force sat down with Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and her grandson Colby at Bergstrom Air Force Base Law Library Building 2102 to tape record their testimonies for posterity. Much of the information you're about to hear comes from this official meeting. On the evening of the 29th of December, Betty and Vickie were looking for a place to go play bingo with their grandson. Originally, they intended to go to a game at Cleveland, Texas, but there was none, so they drove to New Caney, but were disappointed there as well. On the way back home to Dayton, they pulled over at a truck stop, had a bite to eat at around 8:30 p.m. After they ate, they drove along Farm Market Road 1485 on the way to Huffman for a little while until they noticed a strange object in the sky. Initially, they couldn't figure out what it was, an oddity in the sky which was intriguing but not alarming enough to deter them from their route. Once the roads became more rural and encompassed by trees, the spectacle escalated to an incident. All of a sudden, Betty claimed, it just sat down, almost level with the treetops. They were looking at a large diamond-shaped craft, which in a seemingly fantastic burst lit up the entire sky. To say the trio were terrified would be an understatement. We thought the end of the world was coming, Betty stated. At this point, the heat inside the car became so intense from the fire, just shooting out the bottom of the craft, that they had to pull over and get out. Standing behind their car doors, they watched on in shock as Colby began to scream at her grandmas to get back in the car. She soothed her grandson, telling him that it was a good thing and that Jesus was coming and would never hurt us. She prayed as Colby panicked and screamed. Betty looked on in horror and enthralled by curiosity as the heat intensified. Fire would shoot out of it, and then it would let up. The object was slowly descending. Still, they looked on, even as it made a bizarre noise, similar to air brakes, but not quite. There was something clearly eerie and otherworldly about the noise. Then, of course, there was the great roar that it was emitting. Like some great mechanical monster in the sky, it trundled through the air, slowly approaching the trio. Betty stood there, as a deer does in the headlights, whilst Vickie sat at the car, immersed in religious fervor, and Colby screamed at them. There's something compelling in this scene, that the two women almost embarrassingly lose their sense of responsibility for the child in the face of such a phenomenon. It must be stated that this giant craft, described as being the same size as a large water tower, was getting closer to them by the minute. They had time to try to run away. It was not until the craft started to pull away that Betty started to react. The heat had become so intense that Betty had to use her jacket pocket as a hot pad to get back in the car and start the engine. However, the car was dead. Only the radio was playing at a very low volume. I would have tried to have gone on under the car, she's testified. But Vickie told her to stop and emotionally pressed her hand into the vinyl of the car. The heat was so intense that the vinyl had been made pliable enough for her hand to be imprinted and available for later investigators to see. Eventually, Betty and Vickie were able to start the car and drive. Yet this was not the end of the encounter because they decided to drive towards the object. Curiosity compelled them forward. But duty was driving the military above their heads towards the mysterious craft. It must be emphasized that the night has subsided because of the intense light being emitted by the craft. They could see perfectly the helicopters flying by with their twin rotors and markings, designating them as United States Air Force. The first thing that entered my mind, Cash stated, was about the pilots that were in the helicopters, because of the heat that we were feeling there. Betty and Vickie had pulled over again and were counting the helicopters in the sky. 23 according to Betty. Vickie counted 26. At this point again, it is incredible to consider how powerful curiosity and fascination can be. They described themselves as being sick and burning and hot and scared, yet they kept driving towards the object. Some excuses were given as to why they did not turn around, such as the side of the road being too muddy for them to be able to do a 3-point turn. But I don't think they even tried. To the Air Force personnel interviewing them at the base, they described the maneuvers the helicopters were making. They were on both sides of it and looked like they were trying their best to get around the top of it. They had stopped at least 3 times to watch the spectacle. Unbeknownst to them, as this is all happening, all 3 of them are being irradiated or are being injured by some other invisible substance. The one thing that is absolutely certain about this case is that Betty, Vickie, and Colby had sustained injuries that did match up with those that can be caused by ionizing radiation. Once they had driven away from the incident, Betty dropped off Vickie and her grandson at their house and went home herself, feeling extremely ill. I had blisters all over my head, my face, my back, my neck. I was burning from the inside out. Soon after, she developed nodules on her head and scalp, which would frequently burst and run like water. After 4 days of illness, Betty was admitted into Parkway General Hospital as a burn victim. In those 4 days, her eyes had completely swollen shut, and she suffered from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. It took over a week in hospital before Betty could even open her eyes again to see. As well as treating her eyes, they applied burn cream to her face, and allegedly large patches of tissue would be peeled off as they treated her. Dr. V.B. Shenoy, a cardiologist at Parkway General, called in several experts and conducted many tests to find out the cause of Betty's injuries, but nothing could be determined. Even after she was released from hospital, she had bald patches in her hair where it had just fallen out during her time at hospital. A few years later, in 1983, Betty would receive her first treatment for breast cancer, which many have linked with her time witnessing the fiery craft. Vickie and Colby had suffered less than Betty, perhaps because they had stayed in the car longer. However, they still had to deal with medical conditions. Vickie was convinced in the moment that it was the end of the world and that they were about to meet somebody. Whilst in the car, she told Colby to look right inside. If he saw a big man, it'd be Jesus. Over the course of the following year, she developed many problems with her eyes and had to have the area around them frequently drained in order to see. Her eyes worsened to the point that she developed cataracts and even had to have an operation. Vickie also experienced digestive problems and hair loss after the incident, but she seemed to be the most able of the trio and helped take care of Betty and her grandson. Colby's face was sunburned after the event, and he experienced problems with his vision which persisted long afterwards. She testified that Colby had no control over his bowels after the incident and had to care for him like a baby. Nightmares plagued the child for a long time afterwards. The pair of them could no longer work and had accumulated a large amount of medical bills. After their interview at Bergstrom Air Force Base, they were advised by the personnel to hire a lawyer and seek compensation for their injuries. They did just that, suing the federal government for $20 million. Over the next several years, the case went through the courts and involved testimonials from the Air Force, Army, Navy, and even NASA. Persuaded by the persistent denials from the US government agencies, the judge finally dismissed the case on August 21, 1986. Upon examination, investigators have poked holes in Betty and Vickie's testimonies. As legal proceedings began, Captain Jenny Lampley of the US Air Force Congressional Liaison Office in Washington, D.C., dismissed the entire incident offhand because she stated that the Air Force does not operate twin-rotor helicopters like the ones described by the trio. Lieutenant Colonel George Saran of the Army Inspector General's office conducted a more thorough investigation. He found the witnesses to be credible, but could not trace the helicopters to any Army, National Guard, or Reserve unit. The idea that it was a hypothetical Army exercise that left no trace was absurd to Saran due to the extraordinary logistical planning that would have been required, especially during the stand-down period around the holidays, where many personnel were expected to be at home with their families. He could not reach a conclusion. Many researchers agree that Saran conducted a thorough and objective investigation, and although no conclusion was found, the mysterious injuries were real, and their cause seemed as elusive as the UFO. The injuries themselves have come under scrutiny, with researcher Brad Sparks contending that they should have died given their symptoms, as it could not have been radiation, but rather some sort of aerosol. There are those who speculate that the UFO was not extraterrestrial at all, but a top-secret atomic-powered aircraft, experiencing engine problems at the time. Yet the aircraft was sighted fairly close to the city of Houston, not the most ideal place to test out revolutionary aircraft. There are sites of vast deserts in Nevada which would have been better suited than a metropolitan area. And of course, why not cordon off the area better? There were not many roads, and this could have been done easily. It's a baffling case to be sure, although we may poke holes in the testimonies of the witnesses, which are largely consistent, especially if one makes allowances for being clouded by radiation. Indeed, it can be said to serve as a sort of precedent for another incident which happened in Britain in 2016 at Penturk. Similarly, it occurred close to a city, and the craft was reported to have had some sort of energy coming out from the bottom. The military was also there with a variety of aircraft, including helicopters, and they are said to have given chase to the craft. However, it was slightly different, and the energy seemed to be electric, and its shape was more pyramidal instead of shaped like a diamond. But they share more in common than they differ. I recommend you watch our video on the case if you want to learn more. And here we return to the question that we began this video with. What would you have done? If before you stood an extraordinary vision that, depending on your worldview, was coming to you from the future, another planet, or God, what would you do? The responsible thing to have done is, of course, to run like you've never run in your life before, away from whatever it is. But if you're honest with yourself, can you say for sure that you would run? That the part in all of us that looks into the dark and every time wishes for something more will not take over and make you risk everything to have one moment that transcends the mundanity of the everyday and enslaves you to the miracle? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe for more of the paranormal. Or why not visit us in person at ROWTONS Museum of the Paranormal Spirituality for one of our guided tours, seance evenings, tech nights, or ghost hunts. Thank you again. Have a lovely day.